National, that's the party which enacted legislation that gave Waikato Maori command over the allocation of the Waikato River, iwi command over the Taupo catchment, and full Maori control over that massive Urewera water catchment. But this proves that traditionally the National Party, the Nats, have never really opposed co-governance. The past actions of National, by let's take the easy way out, which removes the pressure of those elected irresponsible members of Parliament who much prefer to enjoy an untroubled and well-paid existence in Wellington than actually do their duty and protect New Zealand and New Zealanders. The damage and untold erosion of trust between Maori and the 85% of non-Maori residents in New Zealand was given fuel by Key and a grubby little man that goes by the name of Finlayson. These two, with a cabinet nearly as irresponsible as the current Ardern cabinet, made decisions that made it possible for the concerted drive of Maori for co-governance. Most of us still cannot understand how they, that is the John Key cabinet, allowed Maori so many rights outside of any government norms entrenched by government democracy. Key allowed the Wanganui Maori to register the river as a living being. The midnight visit by a motley crew of Maori led by Sharples to the United Nations to sign the Indigenous Charter when New Zealand already had a Treaty of Citizen Rights. The absolute denial of Finlayson to recognise that there was only one original treaty document, that was the original treaty document in English. The Key Cabinet and caucus laid the path to separatism and Maori co-governance, did all that even though Don Brash had laid out the consequence some years before at Orewa. The Key government, or maybe simply the spineless Nats, rejected the very being and reason that brought their party back from the dead. All this capitulation to Maori pressure groups who so wrongly use the word racist, and not one cabinet member ever stood up and told them to piss off and stop using their childish argument. So the Nats gave us a spineless Prime Minister who never once seemed to stand up to the Maori pressure groups and the constant Maori bullying, mostly from the Maori Party. So New Zealand lurched from 9 years of ministerial mismanagement and continued to pave the very dubious path of Maori domination that started with the actions of Doug Graham, who knew that the treaty had already been well served and no longer of any true value to modern New Zealand, yet he did. Now we have ended up with a Labour Prime Minister who may be in her 40s but still believes she is 16, with ideological thoughts that she has developed in her mind as the religious truth. A religion people that now follow every word of what could be described as the Antichrist who heads the World Economic Forum. There must be some Labour parliamentary members who are very unhappy with the disastrous path that their government is taking, yet none have had the courage to speak out, declaring their discomfort of the policies being pursued by the Labour Party leadership and its capitulation to a Maori caucus. They have allowed the Maori caucus, in fact, to become more authoritative and even more powerful than Cabinet. One of the latest examples of just how incompetent the National Party really is, their candidate for Hamilton West by-election is of Tainui, the same tribe going for broke with the help of Mahuta, the Maori King, and with Tuku Morgan to become the shadow government. Currently we have Maori interests that are Tainui Maori interests being driven by Tuku Morgan and his mantle of saying he is representing the Maori king, a royal identity whose influence in real terms only really goes as far as the Ngaruahia's park front gate's letterbox. But with grubby Willie Jackson, with Mahuta, her husband, and selected family members, with Mahuta being in government as a minister, we have really no one to stop their pathway to getting control in time of all water here in New Zealand, yes, even the water you have collected free from the sky that you store in your water tanks. Most accept that our freshwater systems had deteriorated due to lack of infrastructure updates and maintenance. The situation has helped Maori separatist movement and the Maori elite to play the card that they, if given co-governance over the water, that is the Maori, would manage it so much better. Well, I don't believe that poppycock. Any co-governance with Maori up to now mostly has turned to custard. It seems the Nats have lost any desire to be a government for the people and the long-term aspiration of those who work hard and get on and make a successful life for themselves, their families and community. Wonder how many national members and supporters have read the founding charter as established by Sid Holland. If they did and used it as policy, they just may, yes, they just may once again become a viable opposition, and they could even possibly become government. I do not believe the Nats have a clue where they sit in the political scene. The Nats are not worth considering, in my view, even as a viable opposition, certainly as they are still moving closer and closer to Labour. That Nat label of a few years ago has never really disappeared in describing the National Party, as they seem hell-bent to become a second Labour government embracing Labour's policies and desire to sell New Zealand out to the Maori elite. National, if elected, would soon become out of control and again, like the key government, to become rogue to the aspirations of most New Zealanders as they settle down under the new party colours purple. Why purple? Well, National, they've always had blue. Yes, it always stood out as being national. But desire now to go more like Labour, and as they move across to the dominant red to the left, put the blue with that, and what do you get? You get purple. So you don't believe me that National's changing their colour to purple? Well, have a look at the National Party's latest colour schemes now being used on their pamphlets and correspondence. They're quite nuts, you know. Even the Luxton's fellow is so wrong and will not cut the mustard with most things in New Zealand. Who, in the name of goodness, is going to vote for a party who is led by a rampant globalist? The Labour government is out of control and going rogue. The Select Committee process has been treated as a joke when passing many recent laws. I can't see any improvement in the situation with Luxton-led national government. Can you? With the national mob, co-government would still be on the agenda, even though the treaty is no longer applicable, yes, no longer any relevance to any modern-day New Zealand citizen, as it was a document for a totally different time and people.